Thanks, John. And Rich, thanks so much for joining us today in the midst of what is a very interesting time for the theatrical movie business. Just yesterday, we heard from Disney that they aim to distribute some of their films in theaters. At the same time, they offer them on their streaming service, Disney Plus, for an additional $30 fee. I'm wondering what you make of all of this and what kind of threat it poses to the movie business.
So, Julia, I think you a little bit buried the lead with your question. I think the lead was that Disney is reaffirming its commitment to the theatrical business. They kept about 7 movies, theatrical only release, all the big Marvel movies for the year, Jungle Cruise, a big Pixar movie, Luca. And as a matter of fact, that in the Q&A, Bob Chapek said we made $13 billion last year from theatrical, and that's not easy to replace. And he said, we're going to be a little bit flexible during the pandemic. And the movies you referred to are very early releases, March kind of things. And I think what he did was very smart. I mean, while we're in the middle of a pandemic, especially in the United States, he said, we're going to be a little bit flexible, but he sort of said to protect that box office when things change, we're going to change. So I thought it was overall very good. And then the last point is the buzz coming out of this, other than the financial buzz, is that the next Star Wars is going to be directed by Patty Jenkins. And I know they announced a lot of TV episodes and things, but as with the movie business, the buzz comes out of the theatrical.
Yeah, you are right, Rich, that there was an affirmation of a commitment to the theatrical business, but it sounds like there will be a lot of flexibility in terms of deciding what content is going to go straight to Disney Plus and what will have a theatrical release. But I do want to point out, though, that this stands in contrast to what we just heard from WarnerMedia. They announced that they're, for the next year, going to be releasing 18 films in theaters at the same time as they're available on HBO Max. Does that pose a bigger threat to the theatrical movie-going business?
You know, I wouldn't use the word threat. I think it was mostly a lack of understanding of a lot of elements of how the theatrical business works. First of all, when people make movies, they're different than making TV things for streaming. So when big directors like Chris Nolan or Denis Villeneuve or Patty Jenkins envision their movies, they envision them on the big screen, and they do special effects that way, lighting, camera. They're telling a visual story in a certain way. That doesn't translate well to the small screen, and it's not what the talent wants, as you know, Julia, because there's been a huge outpouring this week. They've had a lot to say about that. So I do understand what Time Warner did, or WarnerMedia, during the pandemic. It makes a lot of sense. You know, if they wanted Wonder Woman out and they wanted to put it on their platform where people don't feel safe to go, I get that. But if you look at international results, IMax is a global company. We're in 82 countries, and we're killing it in China and Japan, where our attendance is basically at 100% of where it was pre-pandemic. So I just don't, for the life of me, understand why WarnerMedia would give up that box office. It doesn't make any sense, except during a pandemic.
So when you say it doesn't make sense, you mean it doesn't make sense that WarnerMedia made that commitment for the next 18 films through the end of next year? And if that's the case, do you think the theater chains that you're partnered with are going to refuse to show some of those films? What is the upshot of that not making sense?
Well, first of all, you know, we'll see whether that holds for all films over that period of time. I think once theatrical comes back, and I think it'll become roaring back as it has in other places, you know, I think they're going to look at those numbers. And for movies, especially later in the year, like Suicide Squad or Dune, I think they're going to look at the market and they're going to say this just doesn't make sense. So I predict that they're likely to change what they say they're doing now. And I also think more interesting than whether exhibitors play it is what happens to the talent. A lot of high-profile talent has gone on record and saying they don't want to work for WarnerMedia. And I think if you're in the studio business and you take a long-term view, you've got to be responsive to that. In terms of exhibitors, I think the really interesting question, Julia, is the international piece. So HBO Max is only in the United States, and their narrative is, well, maybe in the U.S., Windows, people won't play it, but internationally, that's where we'll make up a lot of our box office. But, there's one key element there. The same people that own Regal, Cineworld, are one of the biggest exhibitors in Europe. AMC owns Odeon and Nordic Cinemas. Wanda owns AMC. So I think kind of being firm on the windows in North America may not provide a lot of comfort to those people overseas. And I think it's going to be interesting to see whether they play it or not.
Rich, it's Carl. Your point about the talent is so well taken because we know what Christopher Nolan said. We had Dwayne Johnson on our air earlier in the need to be protected. I mean, how much can the industry use the talent as a wedge against some of these moves by the studios?
Well, Carl, as you probably know, I don't think that a lot of that top tier talent is really going to be leveraged. They're going to say what they think. They're quite independent people. And I think the thing that people are missing is that it's an art. So I understand where a newspaper goes online or it goes into print. I get that analogy. It makes sense. But big filmmakers make things for a giant screen, and they have a creative vision. And the actors, like think about Top Gun this year and Tom Cruise. Tom waited, 40 years since the last one to do this. And I just think, that talent independently, they don't want to make TV shows. And if you think of Lin-Manuel Miranda, with Into the Heights, he could have gotten more money by making that for streaming. And the same thing with Hamilton. He affirmatively chose the theatrical experience because that's the way he wanted to see it. So I don't think it's going to go down well for them. And I don't think this is a storm that's going to blow over in a few days. I think it's a real issue. And I think actually it's going to have even more influence than what exhibitors think. And
Rich,
especially IMaX, which is in the really event business. I mean,
Rich,
I don't think that's going to play out.
We've been talking about the importance, the power of theaters, but I got to ask you about something else. 18 months ago, you guys introduced IMaX Private Theater, and granted, it's not for everybody. It's $500,000, I think, is kind of the entry cost there. But I wonder during this time, A, how have those kinds of sales been going? And B, are you interested in continuing to offer perhaps a little bit lower tier, more accessible versions of that IMaX experience in home?
So we've pivoted away from offering that product because it was too expensive and, a little wrong for the market at the time. However, we pivoted to something called IMaX Enhanced, which is a way that we up resolution images in the home for large TV sets. So we're doing it now with Sony and TCL and Philips. And so if you're at home and you want to watch streaming on your large TV set, we make that image look a lot better in that way. And that seems to us a much more sensible way to get into the home than $500,000 TV sets. And it's been a good part of our strategy, and we think it's one that's going to grow. But for the time being, even though there's a pandemic, we have a lot of faith in the theatrical experience.
Speaking of which, Rich, I'm curious for your insight into the trends you're seeing in the markets where theaters are really open again. What are the trends you're seeing in terms of the types of movies you are finding people want to see? And how do you expect the theatrical movie-going experience to be different on the other side of this, both in the types of movies that are successful and in what the actual theaters themselves look and feel like?
So the movies that have done really well, not surprisingly, Julia, are a lot of the epic ones. So in Japan, there was a movie called Demon Slayer, which got released, and it was the biggest IMAX gross ever. Pandemic, no pandemic. There are restrictions on capacity. In China, there have been a number of kind of big films that have done extremely well. The smaller films are still doing fine, but it's really the blockbusters which people want to go out to. And that's kind of what be more blockbusters post-pandemic and probably less mid-level movies. And if you look at a lot of the movies that Disney is moving to the streaming service now, they tend to be lower budget, smaller movies. Movies like Black Widow and movies like Spider-Man. I mean, people really want to see those in theaters. So I think you'll see a change in balance to more blockbuster and less of the smaller movies, especially with some of the windowing changes, which are likely to continue post-pandemic. I do think, J.J. Abrams made a great quote the other day I read where he said the Roaring '20s were roaring, and part of the reason was that the Spanish flu epidemic ended. And, I love streaming, and I think it's great, but I want to get out of the house. And I think a lot of people do.
Well, Rich, let's hope that we have the quick deployment of that vaccine so we can get into a roaring 20s phase for the movie industry. We appreciate you joining us, and we hope you'll come back and fill us in as all of these changes are implemented next year. Rich Gelfond, CEO of IMax, thanks so much.
Shepard Smith here. Thanks for watching CNBC on YouTube.